So what we're going to kind of do here is, and if you've got this Photoshop document that you've put together, you might bring it out. If you didn't do the Photoshop document, you still want to do it. There's the sample that's up on Brightspace, but I've added a couple of the little things into mine. So we created, just to refresh, on Wednesday, we created this multi-layer document in Photoshop. And basically we just took a bunch of photos and created different layers out of them. So I've named them all. I've added a couple additional ones in here, actually one additional one in here, and then I incorporated another one in After Effects. But I added this tree into the far foreground. And the idea here is setting up multiple planes within a Photoshop document that we can then import into After Effects and animate ever so subtly. And by taking this, I created an oversized document that, if I scrub through here, the individual layers move to varying degrees and varying amounts. Like I said, it's oversized. And my final composition is a 1920 by 1080, which I put together, and then I just placed that oversized composition into it. And basically I'm cropping it within my final image here, so that when I play it, what I end up with is some very kind of extreme perspectives. So I've got this, even though this is my foreground, I've got this kind of foreground, if you will, with this tree, that as I pulled it through, I blurred it, sort of give that sense of depth. And I didn't really do that to these, but I can. And we'll look at that. And what we'll look at doing is doing this technique simply with 2D transforms. We can certainly do it with a 3D camera, which maybe we'll look at as well. But it's something that's not totally necessary to get the effect that we're going for. So we could have multiple layers in here which we push a camera through, take advantage of the depth of field and the fine tuning. But this process here simply uses our 2D transforms to scale and move position on these different layers. At the end of the day, while we're trying to do these, there's not a hard and solid formula. It kind of depends upon the amount of movement you want and what you need to move in order to get a convincing effect. It's not super realistic, it's not ultra realistic, but it does give that sense of different layers and sense of movement. So we're just going to do this with 2D transforms, and they're pretty simple processes. And then I sort of augmented that a little bit with, I found a piece of video of flames, and I incorporated that into the front. I figure if it's a crashed spaceship, there's probably some fire around. So I incorporated that a little bit. And it could probably be done better, but it gives that sense of, movement and action within this. And the flames just use a fairly simple masking technique that I'll look at briefly, once I get through the initial portion of it. So your document will probably have different layers. I kind of augmented mine a little bit. Because I want to be able to do a few different things. But I've got my tree, which I should probably, I'll leave those alone. My foreground mountains, and they're all totally different, I just use color adjustments, color balance to kind of change the coloring on the different layers to sort of get them relatively in line with each other. So when I jump over into After Effects and I take a look at my primary landscape, these just all move at different paces. So I'm going to create a new, I started with this, but I'm going to create a new project and just import that Photoshop document that I had. So we'll find my landscape. And whenever I do this, I want to make sure that I import it as a composition, but retain my layer sizes. Retaining the layer sizes just make sure that I don't have an awful lot of extra space to contend with. So composition, retain layer sizes, and open it. And here are all my layers along with my landscape composition. So I'm going to actually animate the landscape composition and then import it into another comp, a 1920 by 1080 comp. So if I open this up, zoom back on it, I can make this as big as I need to make it. Right now, I think I've got it roughly, what is it right now? Right now it's 2880 by 1920. The idea is just to give ourselves a lot more space to work with than we really need. So we can isolate particular areas of this if we wanted to, but the idea is just to give ourselves plenty of room to work. So I've got these mountains here across the middle. That's probably going to be the widest portion of my scene. So if I were to take this right now, create another composition at 1920 by 1080, at 10 seconds or whatever, I could start by just sort of taking this landscape composition, dropping it into my new composition, and sort of size up how I want to scale this. So just going to kind of scale it down a little bit until my mountains are just within the scene to kind of frame it. And slide this up a little bit, maybe, something like that. So that's how my scene will crop, even though this is my overall. So one of the things that I'll do from time to time is, I'm animating in this, I'm importing it into another one. It'd be nice to be able to kind of see roughly the area that I'm working with. So what you can do is kind of size up where that falls. And I showed you this last time, I think. After Effects has an area of interest, which is kind of your focal area. And if I turn that on and then I draw an area out sort of like this, that'll at least give me a sense of what my crop is going to be in my other composition. And I can turn that off if I need to at any time, turn it back on. Just consider it kind of cropping within After Effects. I could crop my entire composition to this if I wanted, but I'm just going to use it for reference so that I know sort of roughly where I want to work at. So I'm going to start with this tree that I've got in front. And like I said, we're just going to use simple 2D transforms to do most of this. So here's my tree. It came in as its own composition. And I believe the reason it came in as its own composition is because if we look back to my, it's somewhat unexpected, which is the only reason I'm kind of exploring this. I think it's because I placed a color balance and paired it with that layer in my Photoshop. You know, in Photoshop, you can, if you hit that Option key, you can link a layer to another layer, create a cropping mask out of it, clipping mask out of it. I think that's why it created that as an additional composition. It didn't separate the layers for me into different parts. It combined those into a comp. So jumping back over to After Effects, let's just start with this. And over the course of my 10 seconds, I'm just going to change my scale and my position on these things. So let's start with this. At 0, we'll set my scale and my position. And then maybe I'll just come out here to say 6 seconds. I'm just kind of guessing. We'll adjust timing later. And I'm going to do my scale first, I think. Open these both up. We'll start with scale. Zoom out on it so I got plenty of room to work. Grab that. Scale that up. Maybe a little more. And then pull it across. So that as I virtually pull towards my subject, I sort of walk past that object. That's the basic concept of all of this. What's the closest to us is going to move and scale the most. What's furthest away from us is going to move and scale the least. So another effect that would come into play is blurring. As this gets closer to me, it probably falls in my periphery and kind of blurs. So maybe what I'll do is add if I go into with this layer selected, I'll go into my effects panel down to blur and sharpen, and I'll just use a Gaussian blur because it's simple. And I'll set the amount of blurriness, set it to 0 there. And by the time I get out here, I'm actually going to stop this right about here and crank up the blurriness on it. So that as it comes towards me, it kind of blurs and then moves out of the frame. A little bit of transparency might help. I kind of imagine that things kind of there's a perception that they kind of tend to blur in your periphery a little bit and kind of lose a little bit of their form, if you will. And they don't actually, but it's just more of a perception than anything else. So any perception that we can kind of further helps us in composing our scenes. So maybe back about here we set our opacity to 0, but maybe we just, as we get out to about here, maybe we drop that off just a little bit. And if we let that play, kind of moves. I kind of feel like movements for these, except at the end, linear movement kind of works best, but I think as you get close to the end, nearing your stopping point, easing into those a little bit makes sense. So do that. We can always pop back over here to our final comp, which I should probably actually name. And see how that kind of plays. So that works out pretty well. And I can adjust my timing with that a little bit. I can make it last longer or whatever, maybe less time, I don't know. We'll have to see when we get everything else animated. Back to our landscape. I'm gonna hide my area of interest for a moment. So I think I'm gonna start off with my foreground smaller than what I've got it here. So if I go to my foreground, I'm just going to kind of scale this down some. Maybe I'll slide it over and up. If I go back to my final comp, I'm still all inside of the frame. So we'll do that. Turn that region of interest back on just to see it. And I'm going to do the same process with the additional layers. Turn that off. I do think I want to reset my center point a little bit. I think I'm going to put it up a little closer to my imaginary horizon line. Just think about this. It's one of the things when I did my original demo I didn't do. I thought maybe it might make a difference. But based upon your images that you choose, the exact steps you take might vary a little bit. Again, we're going for a final look, not necessarily matching a specific set of steps. So we'll just set our foreground position and our foreground scale. And move out here to, say, 8 seconds. And I'm just going to scale this up. We'll go like that. You see, as we kind of scale those, we get that bit of separation between one and the other. And then maybe it needs to drop a little bit. So maybe when I come out here, my position should sort of slide down a hair. Place my region of interest back in there. We can kind of see it's not bad. Just gives us that sense that we're moving through a space, forward to back. We'll leave that there, go to the mountains. These are going to move even less. So let's get rid of that. Set our mountain position and scale. And then come out here, what I do to 8 seconds, I think. We're just gonna grow it a little bit. And maybe I'll move my, we'll leave the center point where it's at. So we'll scale this up just a little. Maybe too much, I don't know. And maybe we'll slip it down a little bit. I'm not sure. Get bigger. Let's see what we get there. We pop back over here and take a look. We've got some degree of movement through all of our layers. Maybe my foreground needs to move a little bit more. Kind of work back and forth between our layers and see what we've got. I think the last thing I think I'm going to move Saturn here, just sort of across the sky before I go much further. And he's not going to move towards us at all. He's just sort of static and sort of going to arc across the sky a little bit. So maybe we position him there, and we bring him up all the way through the end of our comp. Kind of bring him up above. Let's try that. He might move a little quickly, I don't know. One of the things I had done is I have my sky background, but I had duplicated it, masked out the clouds in the foreground so that it looked like he's kind of behind all of that. So I could, maybe my foreground clouds, maybe I slide these over a little bit. And between there and there, maybe these kind of part somewhat. Oops. I didn't set a keyframe for those. Do that again. Put that over. Seconds, maybe we just pull this back to about here, maybe. So now if we go back in here and take a look at our final, we've got all these varying layers of movement that kind of give life to that environment. And we can incorporate as many different pieces in there as we want. I mean, the number of layers I've got just kind of keeps it simple. I think I want this guy to scale a bit more though. So I'll pop back over here, look at my foreground. Let's see, let's close all these guys up. Let's grab this foreground, and as we get out here to 8 seconds, which I think is, yeah. Zoom in to make sure I'm right on top of my keyframes. Yeah. I think I'll just scale him up some more. See how that works. So everything kind of moves. You can see this kind of movement is very difficult to, it depends upon what you're doing, but like trying to loop this over a course of 10 seconds is kind of rough because you need a different type of scene than what I've got here, but this just kind of gives that sense of movement and parallax. And there's probably a lot of different things I could do there. I mean, I should probably pay a little closer attention to my horizon line, although this doesn't look horrible. and how things kind of meet up across the middle. I mean, but from the standpoint of the technique, it's kind of the way it works. Everything in front moves the most. As it gets further away from you, it moves the least. At least that's the perception. So, and then in the composition that I had done earlier, I had some flames in here, and all I did to do those, actually if I import, I think I left these in my downloads folder. Drop this in here. Put that. So I had this flame image that I found on Pexels or Unsplash. Oops. And it's kind of perfect because it's got that black background that's going to be very easy to use as a mask. And I could probably try just laying it into my landscape. Let's see what happens. Actually, I didn't really try this before, but zoom in, take this video and lay it in. Scale it down a little bit. And then if I set on that layer, if I set its blending mode to screen, remember screen's going to eliminate our blacks, multiply eliminates our whites, basically. If I set it to screen, that gets rid of the blacks, but it kind of washes out the rest of it as well a little bit. Oh no, it's not terrible. Let's see. So if we were to play that through, actually it doesn't look terrible, but we'll try a different kind of thing as well. So I'm going to make a comp out of this video. So if I just right click on it, I'm going to create a new comp from the selection, and we'll call this our flames. And I'll open that up. So we can use this image itself as a mask. We can use the image as a mask for itself. And the way I'm going to do that is to, I'm just going to use some adjustment layers on this initially and create a black and white image out of this that I can use as a alpha mask to hide the black area and some of the faded areas. So the thing about, one of the things to remember about After Effects, and again, I think I've mentioned before that an awful lot of the apps, Photoshop, After Effects, Illustrator, they're all really similar in a lot of their overlapping functionality. And under your layers, let's see, let me grab this. Under effects, sorry, your color correction layers, the items you see in these color correction layers that mimic Photoshop really work the same as Photoshop. I mean, there's not much of a difference at all, and remember we can stack them as well. So, I mean, it's a technique that I use a lot in Photoshop of, creating masks out of images that I can then paste into an alpha channel. We're not going to do an alpha channel, but we will do a layer that can be an alpha or a luma mask. So if I want to start with this and do something as simple as convert it to black and white, I've got that. And I think that I'll pump my reds up a little bit and yellows. I want to watch that I don't get too much of a glow around the thing. But I can kind of enhance that black and white image a little bit, sort of brighten it up. And then I can go back into these color correction channels and I could pick curves or any number of other options here. Maybe I'll just do a brightness and contrast, maybe. So I can brighten the white areas, but I can strengthen the contrast just a little. So I can kind of see some spread in that glow coming out there, but what I could also do, I guess, is duplicate this and maybe I set the blend mode here to multiply to kind of darken the black area so I don't get any of that sort of bleed. And, or maybe multiply isn't it? Maybe it's, I don't know, overlay? Actually, overlay might work pretty decently on that. We'll try that. And maybe I'll just sort of knock the opacity back on that just a little bit. Something like that. I can use that composition, I can use that set of images as a mask. So if I take those, I can pre-compose those into one, call this my flames mask. And now drop my flames video back down on top for just the transparency. And we will set flames mask on that as a luma. Still got some spread in the black area there, but I've isolated those. And now if I take this back into my landscape, I'm going to just turn that one off for a moment. Bring my flames comp in here. Bring that down. I probably want to mask out those at the bottom, but for now we'll just do that. And maybe we do look at applying a bit of a transparency layer to that. Good screen. No. Overlay. Might look okay. So regardless of how I want to go about that, I'll just sort of set that sort of right here at the base of that. And I'm going to parent that to whatever my foreground layer does. So I'll just parent those flames to the foreground so that they move with it. So when I go back and look at my final, I've got kind of that secondary motion going on in it. And I could fine tune that mask a little bit to sort of blend some of these areas up here a little bit better, maybe, a little nicer. But you get the idea. The same process that I use for the flames works with smoke. Any number of sort of area effects like that. But fairly simply, we've made a pretty, a pretty decent kind of push through. Does a lot of different things. Maybe our mountains should actually be, let's take a look at our mountains real quick. Maybe those should actually blur just a little bit. Maybe when we get up to about here, we want them to have no blur. Maybe when they start off back here, you give them a little. Could give them a lot, but we'll just give them a little. Go back to our final. Take a look. So they come into focus as we pull towards it. It's not half bad. A lot of it's just kind of playing around with it, getting, searching for that final look that you're really going for. I mean, I think anytime I've done this sort of thing, the approach has been slightly different. But it's the exact same way the Disney camera worked, by and large. We're just doing it with different layers within software. So anyway, that's sort of parallax effect, pulling it towards us. So it may work out, something like that works decently for your composition. You may do something that's more of a side to side like we looked at on Wednesday. But that's the general effect. So you use the rest of the class